What's up, heathens? How ya doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologists' claims to give you good arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today we have a Christian that's going to be using Batman to argue against atheism.
So, how do all these points undermine atheism and support the claim that a God exists? Because if atheistic naturalism is true, then the Joker, not Batman, is the rational one. Or, at the very least, the Joker is no less rational than Batman is.
Oh, so you're going the absolute morality route that you call objective, but it's actually absolute morality. And it's somehow dictated by your God? Well, technically, Jewish rabbis about 2,000 or so years ago, their standard for morality. Okay, whatever. If you want to hear this guy's moral case against atheism using Batman, then please stay tuned. So, we've heard this moral argument several times before. Some Christians out there need an absolute set of moral values in order for morality to even exist. They can't seem to accept that morality is just an emergent property of complex nervous systems. And this is congruent with what we see in nature. We find other semi-sentient life existing here on Earth that seems to have some kind of basic moral foundation. Why would God give these other life forms this sense of morality? Why would his absolute rules for human nature change over time? Why is this God so specific about how to worship him, but when it comes to morality, he seems to warp whatever moral values he has in mind to meet whatever humans will accept at the time? On moral absolutism or objectivism, these questions don't have an answer other than, well, that's how God wanted it to be. And that's not really an answer. The video that we are going to be watching today uses the dualism inherent to the Batman storyline as a way to prove that atheism is nonsensical and theism is the only answer. So let's hear what he's got to say.
In August of 2018, several articles appeared online that stated that Batman did not believe in God. He was, in a word, an atheist. Naturally, as a lifelong Batman fan, this revelation piqued my interest. After all, it's not every day that you hear that your favorite childhood superhero holds a philosophical position that is the exact opposite of your own. Now, obviously, Batman is a fictional comic book character, so his status as an actual atheist is rather questionable.
No, I don't think it's questionable. Characters and stories can have all sorts of characteristics. Atheism is only one part of the Batman character. It also would make sense that he is an atheist. Batman doesn't fight crime so that God can sort them out later. And he doesn't sentence his enemies to death so that they can meet their maker. Batman acts as a balancing force between the criminal elements of society and a police force or a policing capability that cannot handle the criminal elements of that society. And he relies on the justice system to bring justice to his enemies. He doesn't just leave it up to a supernatural deity. Batman sees an injustice being done and he takes action immediately. He does this using his own subjective moral foundation. And that's exactly what I would expect out of an atheist.
However, as a thought experiment, let's assume that it's true. Let's assume that Batman is an atheist. And, in addition to that, let's also assume that the whole Batman storyline is true in reality. So, Batman exists, the Joker exists, the whole thing is real.
Okay. I mean, we don't have to actually accept this in order to hypothetically think this situation out. I mean, we can work within the storyline that is Batman. But okay, whatever. Batman's real?
At the same time, let's also assume that the only viable and coherent form of atheism is atheistic naturalism, which states that the only thing that exists is the natural, material world. And note that while we are assuming this claim for the sake of brevity, it is a claim that has been strenuously argued for by both believers and unbelievers alike. Consequently, it is not just some unsupported assertion, but one that has strong arguments behind it.
Apologists love to use the buzzword atheistic naturalism. This just simply means somebody that doesn't believe in a god and thinks that the natural world is all that exists. Given the fact that there's nothing that suggests naturalism is false, the best conclusion that you can make is that the natural world is all that exists. I think that until you can prove that the natural world isn't all that exists, naturalism will continue to be the most tenable position.
So, with these assumptions in mind, we can now investigate how Batman supports theism while also seriously undermining the rationality of atheistic unbelief.
Okay, I can't wait for this shit show. Let's do it.
To see how this is the case, consider that if atheism is true, then Batman is a fool. Not only is Batman a fool, but the Joker is right. In fact, if atheism is true, then the Joker is more rational than Batman is.
Rational means that something is in accordance with logic and reason. You're saying that Batman is a fool based on what exactly? I mean, you don't seem to be making a rational argument for why Batman is a fool. If you mean Psalm 14:1, which calls atheists fools, then you really don't have an argument. Batman has rationalized his way into his position not only because of what happened to his parents, but also because of what he's witnessed happen in Gotham on a daily basis. I mean, the police force couldn't or wouldn't stop the criminal element. It's logical to think that the police will either continue to be unable to or unwilling to prevent the criminal element from creating the imbalance that exists in Gotham. He has the means and the motive to be that counterbalancing force. What would be illogical is to think that God will set things right or that God's judgment will somehow catch up to them. This is illogical because God was supposedly in action while these wrongs were being committed. Why should you expect God to step in now just because you started noticing shit? So I don't understand how the Joker is more rational than Batman. At most, he could be just as rational as Batman, just with a different moral foundation. Most likely, though, Joker is at the other end of the spectrum than Batman. If Batman is hyper-rational, then the Joker would have to be hyper-irrational. I mean, that's how dualism works.
Think about it. Night after night, Batman goes out, trying to stop crime, trying to prevent evil, and trying to help the innocent. Psychologically, Batman is a mess. He is a man who suffers so much that he decides to dress like a bat in order to avenge what was done to him and to achieve justice for others. Personally, he has no life, for his whole life is geared towards his existence as the Dark Knight. Indeed, his only purpose is to be the Bat, to protect, to save, and to avenge. And when it comes to morality, he has his unbreakable moral rule. He won't kill anyone, not even someone like the Joker.
Well, I would say that Batman has a much more substantial moral foundation than just don't murder people. And Batman is definitely psychologically scarred by his past. I mean, his parents were killed right in front of him. Don't you think that'd fuck you up too? This is also something that both the Joker and Batman share, to differing degrees. They are both psychologically damaged, but how they handle that psychological damage is what differentiates them. Bruce Wayne is definitely a mask for Batman. And I mean, we could debate on how psychologically healthy that is for the actual person of Bruce Wayne, but we really don't need to get into that here. And there's no real point in making this distinction.
Yet a problem now arises, because as Richard Dawkins and many other atheistic naturalists, like Alex Rosenberg and Joe Marks, have told us, on atheism there exists no objective or ultimate purpose in life, nor is there any good or evil, or any absolute morality. Morality in an absolute or objective sense does not exist given atheism.
Well, let's be clear here. You're talking about absolute morality, but you're conflating it with objective morality. I think that there's a way that you could redefine things to get objective morality, But at the heart of everything, it's all subjective. So no, absolute morality doesn't exist, but that's because we're restricted by our own experiences. Morality is an emergent property of sentient and semi-sentient beings. We don't have absolute morality, we just have morality. We all have our own subjective moral foundation with which to judge actions as good, bad, right, and wrong.
And even if it did, on atheistic naturalism, who cares? Nothing, ultimately, is going to happen to you for any pain, suffering, or evil that you cause. There is no afterlife to punish you for your immoral actions.
Funny that you should mention this, because the Christian theology actually doesn't have God punishing people for the immoral actions that they commit during this life. The only punishment that occurs after you die is whether or not you get sent to hell. And you don't get there by being an immoral person. You get there by not believing in Jesus as the only way to heaven. So even on your own worldview, people are not getting punished for their immoral actions. This is what makes Batman's position more rational than a theistic one that's based on this punishment after you die. Batman seeks justice in the only way that we can actually see justice being served. He makes that happen. He doesn't leave it up to God.
And while society may catch you and punish you for your crimes, it's also true that it might not. Furthermore, you might not even care about such punishment. So, even the threat of facing punishment in this life is a weak deterrent to immorality and evil.
And you think your God's a deterrent? Clergy, pastors, and priests violate young children all the time. And all the time, your God forgives them. You see, because they believe in Jesus and presumably they ask for forgiveness of their sins, they are in fact not punished in the afterlife for the immoral actions that they commit during this life. Religious people are always doing immoral and horrible things, and your hell or God's judgment isn't a deterrent. So I don't know why you're trying to make it out like real-world punishment isn't sufficient. Kind of seems like your brand of punishment is insufficient as well.
Moreover, on the atheistic view, human beings are fundamentally just meat machines. We are just particles in motion, living in a universe that neither knows nor cares about us, nor does it know or care about our pains or our purposes. At most, in this uncaring cosmos, we live for our own subjective purposes and for our own fleeting personal pleasures, if we even live for those.
I was with you up until the fleeting personal pleasures. Sure, some people out there live their life for only themselves without thinking about others. That's not necessarily wrong, but it can be very bad. Boiling us down to just meat machines is a poor attempt to demean the atheist position that we're nothing special in this universe. I mean, we're special because we're alive, and most things in this universe are not alive. We aren't special in that the universe doesn't revolve around us or our issues. Reality doesn't give a fuck about your issues, but that's not a bad thing. We do live out our own subjective purpose in life, and that's okay. Especially when that purpose is just solely believing in Jesus.
So, in such a universe, who really cares if some meat machines feel pain and are hurt and some aren't? Ultimately, it does not matter. Of course, these are brutal and harsh ideas, but if atheism is reality, then these ideas are also true, regardless of how harsh they may be.
What fucking reality do you live in? Because that exactly describes the reality that we live in. Do you live in some kind of alternate reality where everybody cares about the exact same shit that you care about? Right now, I'm sure that you could think of an innumerable amount of other people's pain that you just simply don't care about. You would be using your own subjective moral foundation to determine whether or not you cared about that person's pain. There are also tons of situations out there that you can't possibly fathom that you don't exactly care about right now, but that's probably because you don't know about them. So here's a question. If God is real and he intimately cares about our issues and our pain, then why does he just sit back and watch horrible shit happen? In this particular worldview, from 1939 to 2001, God allowed 16 sex rings to exist in Victoria, Australia. He also sat back and watched Ariel Castro kidnap 3 girls, keep them as sex slaves for 10 years, only to be found by somebody that was just on the street after one of the girls had escaped. God couldn't get out of his lazy boy and do some shit about that? I mean, that's some God you got there. I mean, he can damn a guy to hell for simply not believing in Jesus, but he can't lift a finger to help out 3 girls who had been kidnapped for 10 years being used as sex slaves that entire time.
But now consider the Joker, especially after thinking about both Batman as well as the hard truths about atheism mentioned above. Many people think that the Joker is insane, but he's not. Not really. He's not even a psychopath.
I'm not entirely sure how you arrived at this conclusion. Psychopathy is a mental disorder. That shit doesn't just go away because you don't believe in a god. He's an insane psychopath regardless of a god existing.
At least not necessarily. Rather, the Joker is simply an extremely consistent nihilist, meaning that he's someone who believes that there really is no such thing as right or wrong, and that life has no real purpose or meaning. Indeed, the Joker is just someone who acts as if the things that Richard Dawkins and other atheistic naturalists say are true really are true.
You're convoluting the conversation by acting like this is the only outcome of not accepting that absolute morals exist. This would be a false dichotomy because he's making a distinction that either absolute morals exist or you act like the Joker. The Joker has his own subjective moral foundation, even if that moral foundation is that morals don't exist and that he can do whatever he wants. I also use my own subjective moral foundation to say that this is very wrong and can lead to some really bad situations. There is absolutely no need for absolute morals.
Again, think about it. The Joker does what he wants. He does not worry about such pedestrian things as morality or the whims of society. He sees no good or evil. He just sees particles in motion. Thus, he does not let society or anything else control him or tell him what to do. He makes his own purposes, and if that includes hurting other human meat machines, who cares?
Right, that's what it means to be a sociopath and or a psychopath. These mental disorders exist regardless of whether or not a god exists. There are Christians right now that are both of those things. I mean, just take a look at David Wood. He's a self-professed psychopath and a Christian. You also don't need God in order to manage this mental disorder.
Ultimately, he won't be punished for it. It's not even genuinely wrong in the Joker's eyes. It's just different. After all, on the worldview brought about by atheistic naturalism, why is another person's desire to avoid pain any more important or moral than the Joker's desire to inflict that pain?
Well, that would be where my subjective morality comes into play. I can subjectively say that the Joker's desire to inflict pain on others is wrong. And this would be due to my upbringing and also the fact that we live in a society where that shit's not tolerated. It doesn't have to be objectively or absolutely wrong in order for it to be wrong. Wrong in and of itself is subjective.
In the end, it's not. In fact, as nature shows us, the Joker's violence is both natural and extremely consistent with an evolutionary existence that favors power and survival.
Skirt! Gotta stop you right there, bud. That is not related to evolution or survival of the fittest. In the concept of survival of the fittest, it's not always the strongest organism that wins out. It's whichever organism is best adapted to survive in the environment that it finds itself in. In this particular situation, the Joker would actually be the least fit to survive. He's a psychopath that's living in a society that regularly quarantines or kills psychopaths. So no, he's not consistent with evolutionary existence.
Note as well that unlike the sullen Batman, the Joker is perpetually happy. He is constantly laughing, and he gains massive amounts of pleasure not only from the pain that he inflicts on others, but also from the way he lives his life in general. His nihilism brings him great joy. In fact, even when he is caught or imprisoned, the Joker is still laughing and joyous. The punishment against him does almost nothing to minimize the pleasure that he takes in living the way he does.
As opposed to what? We've already shown here that this concept of hell is, one, not actually punishing anybody for the immoral actions that they do during this life, and two, is not actually a deterrent that stops people from doing the immoral actions that they're already doing. In this situation, the Joker only has to ask God for forgiveness, pray to Jesus, and accept him as his one and only savior and the only way to get into heaven. And then he's absolved of his sins and he can just pimp walk right into heaven. He doesn't actually suffer any kind of punishment for the immoral actions that he commits.
So, how do all these points undermine atheism and support the claim that a God exists? Because if atheistic naturalism is true, then the Joker, not Batman, is the rational one. Or, at the very least, the Joker is no less rational than Batman is.
Considering that the entire concept of dualism inherent to Batman rests on Batman being the hyper-rational one, it doesn't make sense for you to turn the tables and try to say that the Joker is actually the hyper-rational one. Or, at the very least, that he's just as rational as Batman. The Joker would be on the other end of the spectrum. He's hyper-irrational. And your statement here is an irrational conclusion to come to whether a God exists or not. Joker is irrational because considering the fact that he's part of a society, it's illogical for him to disrupt the order of that society that he definitely benefits from. But ultimately, we are judging both of these characters on our own subjective moral foundations.
Indeed. Consider the following. Batman pursues justice, even though there is no real justice to be had on atheism, either in this life or the next. Batman has a moral code that restricts him and minimizes what he can do, even though, on atheism, his moral code is no more objectively valid than the Joker's. And Batman suffers, is psychologically broken, and endures great pain for what is, on atheism, an ultimately meaningless mission. By contrast, the Joker is not sad or pained, but endlessly happy. No matter what happens, his life is a life full of personal pleasure and the fulfilling of the desires that he wants to fulfill. And he has no moral code to restrict him from acting as he wishes.
Well, we have already established that on your worldview, people are not judged by their immoral actions after this life. They are merely judged on whether or not they believe Jesus is the only way to heaven. So, in effect, they're not punished for the immoral actions that they take. Again, you don't have to have an absolute moral foundation in order to judge things as right or wrong. Both Batman and Joker are psychologically fucked. I don't know why you're irrationally focusing on Batman's psychological issues. And happiness is not the only way to judge whether or not somebody's life is good. Joker's a psychopath, so he's going to do whatever makes him happy no matter what. I subjectively deem that to be very bad, and there's nothing invalid about that. In the real world, we see these clashes of moral foundations taking place in politics and on social media. I mean, just today, several Middle Eastern countries banned a movie, Onward, for having a lesbian character in it. The religious right constantly wants to legislate a woman's reproductive rights as well as silence the LGBTQ community. And the important distinction to make here is that there are religious people on both sides of those arguments. Obviously, religious people even disagree with each other about their absolute moral foundation.
Consequently, on atheistic naturalism, it is the Joker's way of life that is better and more rational, or at least as good and as rational as Batman's way of life is. And yet, we all know that it is utterly absurd to claim that the Joker's way of life is either better and more rational, or even equal to Batman's way of life. Indeed, it is absolutely obvious that what Batman does and what Batman has dedicated his life to is better, more rational, more meaningful, and more praiseworthy than what the Joker does.
And you're absolutely basing this on what? Your understanding of your religion? If that's the case, then you don't know jack shit about your religion. In the Old Testament, the major sin against God that regularly fucked people up was either not worshiping God the correct way or allowing other religions to exist in their society. Those particular issues don't concern morality whatsoever. You're using your own subjective moral foundation to determine that Batman has a better way of life.
And so, we can formulate the above point into a more formal argument. Premise 1. If atheistic naturalism is true, then the Joker's way of life is better and or more rational, or at least as good and or as rational and just as meaningful as Batman's way of life is.
That's just not true. Anybody can look at the Joker and realize how irrational and psychopathic he actually is. The subjectiveness of the human experience is inescapable. All of your arguments are going to rest upon a subjective base. This would also be a false dichotomy. Like I pointed out before, he's acting as if the only possible conclusion to naturalism is Joker's nihilism. And that is simply not the case.
Premise 2. But the Joker's way of life is not better or more rational than Batman's way of life. Nor is it just as good or as rational or as meaningful as Batman's way of life. And it is clearly absurd to claim that it is.
Okay, it's clearly not better to us using our own subjective moral foundation. Also, this particular premise is predicated upon the first premise, which is flawed, therefore making your entire argument flawed.
Conclusion 1. Therefore, atheistic naturalism is false. Conclusion 2. But if atheistic naturalism is false, and remember, this is the only form of atheism that we are considering as being viable, then its opposite, namely theism, is true. Thus, at least one God exists. And so, this simple but powerful argument from absurdity is how the idea of Batman can be used to dismantle atheism and to support theism over atheistic naturalism.
And your conclusion here is likewise bad, because you think that you've disproven atheism and that the only option available is theism. The inherent problem with your entire argument here is that you assume that theism is the only one with a standard with which to judge moral actions. And you seem to claim that atheism has no standard to judge actions as good or bad. This is a false premise, because obviously we do have our own subjective moral foundations and standards with which to judge actions as good, bad, right, and wrong. Therefore, both of these positions stand on the same ground. And you're just irrationally asserting that one doesn't have a standard with which to judge things as good or bad. And you're just irrationally asserting that one is better than the other. What I've been able to show in this video is that the Joker receives no actual punishment for the immoral actions that he commits during his life on the idea that theism, or specifically Christianity, is the true view of reality. This is because God does not punish people for the immoral actions that they commit in this life. Rather, he punishes people for not believing appropriately. Batman takes the position of counterbalancing the Joker and providing actual justice that can be seen in reality. And this is regardless of whether or not that justice or those punishments deter the criminal behavior. The only position that seems to provide some punishment or justice for the immoral actions that we commit in this life is the atheistic naturalism that you're arguing against. Thank you, heathens, for joining me today. If you will, please go down below, leave me a comment with what you think about this guy's video. Do you agree with him or not? Let me know in the comments below. While you're down there, make sure you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.